are now living in an era of a major breakdown, though, in some of the more fundamental areas of international law. And this is not an accident. This is because the autocratic world, and not only, and some leaders from democracies as well, have begun to deliberately undermine it because they are beginning to see it as a constraint on their own power. So just to give you an example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which of course defies the UN Charter, which recognizes borders of states, which defies the Geneva Conventions, which says you're not supposed to harm civilians, and yet that's a deliberate goal of this war. The UN Convention on Genocide, which has rules about eliminating groups of people or attacking people for their ethnic or national identity. All those things are being deliberately defied by the Russians, and you can of course find there are echoes of this in what the Israelis do. There are echoes of this in what the Chinese have done. You can find many examples of this all over there, and because that you have this general deterioration, even the aspiration to make international law work, and it's always had some failures, is beginning to falter. And so in that sense, it's for the UK to choose this moment to deliberately not respect laws or undermine laws or attack laws or treaties really that it has signed up to is something that will add to this general sense of breakdown. I can't quantify it. I can't say that this will create 0.2% more difficulties. And I can't explain to you exactly the ways in which this will redound upon the UK. Anything that the British government does to undermine that is, simply adds to the greater deterioration. And I should say, if we're talking about pure perceptions and based on not on statistics or measurements, the UK is perceived around the world, certainly in Europe, but also elsewhere, as a kind of world example. I mean, it's a country that whatever its ranking is in the World Justice Project's list, it certainly is perceived as a country that adheres to and is a stickler for the rule of law. I mean, maybe you're a beneficiary of Dickens novels. I don't know. I mean, but there are many reasons. There are many reasons for it aside from what happens in the UK day to day. And actually, I think that any UK undermining of international law or decision to revoke international treaties or not to abide by international treaties that the UK has signed would probably have a pretty profound effect on, again, this general deteriorating atmosphere, simply because the UK is seen as a kind of pillar of the system. Both elected leaders and autocratic leaders look and watch and see what one another are doing, and imitate one another. So if your impression is that this is a spiraling and worsening problem, I think that's correct. I mean, I have to say, you were asking about Europe and not the United States, but Orban has been a kind of model for a part of, not all of, but a part of the American Republican Party, precisely because he changed his constitution, he changed his legal system, he altered the rule of law in Hungary in ways that enabled his party to stay in power for a long time. And so some of what you're hearing in the United States is exactly the same phenomenon. And I should also say, by way of fairness, that we associate this attacks on the rule of law and attacks on judges and attacks on courts, and actually in America you've had also attacks on lawyers and on the legal profession. We sometimes sloppily say, well, this is a right-wing phenomenon, or it's something to do with the far right. It can also be a far left phenomenon. The great example in our generation is Hugo Chavez and Maduro's Venezuela. So it's a phenomenon that doesn't necessarily have a political color. It doesn't have to be right-wing. It doesn't have to be left-wing. It can be associated with theocracy, like in Iran, or with Bolivarian socialism, as in Venezuela. But it always amounts to the same thing. It's a way for a ruling party or clique or person or cabal to change a democratic system in order to stay in power. And the reason you're seeing so much of it is because people are seeing that it works. That it's a way to alter a political system to give yourself to give yourself more power.
Why? We used to be told that in the old days, before history had ended, we were all getting wealthier, and therefore we'd all behave in a more civilized way. Why is it going wrong worldwide now? What are the underlying causes that link what's happening in India, which is becoming a superpower and proud and so on, with what's happening in Hungary or Venezuela?
That's a question for me.
Yes, it is.
I'm afraid that in the context of this hour-and-a-half committee meeting, I'm not going to be able to give you a full answer. I mean, everybody has their theories. My theory is that it's to do with the nature of political communication and the way in which the internet and social media have successfully polarized all of us. One of the things the rule of law depends on is a shared set of agreements about what is public space and how do our systems work. And we built those shared public agreements in some cases in the case of the United Kingdom, over many centuries. And what social media has done very quickly is divide us into not just groups of people who disagree or have different opinions, but people who have very different factual definitions and understanding of the world. And who are, and who no longer agree about how our systems work or how they should work. They don't share a common sense of cause or purpose. This is more profound in some countries than in others. Actually, I think the UK, maybe this is very unpopular, I don't know, but partly thanks to the BBC, the UK maintains more of a shared public space than some other countries, than the United States, for example. But in places where it's very profound, you now have, parts of the country not considering other parts of the country to be legitimate citizens or to have legitimate rights or to be legitimate participants in public debate. And you can see that in India, you can see that in the United States, you can see it in Brazil. Of course, you can see it in autocracies who sometimes deliberately try to create these divisions as a way of keeping people out of politics. But I think it's fundamentally underlying this is that very deep polarization. And I do think it goes back to the way in which we get and process information. Almost every big change in media and in information culture that you have throughout human history creates an enormous change in politics, whether it's the invention of the printing press, which leads, I'm now being very brief, but leads to religious wars, or whether it's the invention of radio, which was the great tool of both Hitler and Stalin, and then of course was the great, FDR created President Roosevelt created the a radio response. All of each one of these tools has created different kinds of politics, and I think this has been one of the effects of social media on all of us, and that to me is the only explanation that accounts for the same phenomenon happening in countries that otherwise have really nothing in common, nothing economically in common, nothing historically in common, nothing geographically. Economics can't explain why very, very successful countries, like Poland, for example, whose income is rising rapidly, have the same problem as countries who are not economically successful.